Even before Keene, New Hampshire's chance for the Steamtown, USA Museum died on the floor of the State House, attention had turned elsewhere. On February 19, 1963, just 3 days after the vote, the Brattleboro Reformer ran a column titled Chance for Vermont, in which they pointed out that the failure to launch in Keene gave Vermont a second chance at the attraction.
Advantages for the state would accrue not only from tourist trade. The scope of the museum, the lifespan of steam and all its various uses, will make it of enormous educational and historical value as well. It would be a fine thing if the Greater Vermont Association, the state's Chamber of Commerce, would get behind this and give it a push. And chambers of Bellows Falls and Rutland and all points between could help with their endorsement too. We have a second chance and should jump for it. Brattleboro Reformer, February 19th, 1963.
It has been hinted that Mr. Blount, a railroad buff of the first degree, may next investigate Vermont's receptivity to Steamtown. This brings us, we hope, back to the original idea, that of locating it in the Lower Valley area with which the project was first proposed. We'll be interested in seeing what happens next. Claremont Eagle, February 22nd, 1963.
As previously noted, Nelson Blount had been considering Vermont as a home for Steamtown, USA, and his Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern Tourist Railroad since the Keene proposition had started to sour in September 1962. Blount had been in open discussion with Vermont's Governor F. Ray Keyser Jr., as well as his successor, Philip H. Hoff. Governor Hoff assured Blount that Vermont was very much open to the opportunity that New Hampshire had passed over, albeit without the same level of state funding. Most importantly, however, the state was willing to negotiate a lease on a section of track that had recently come into the state's possession. The Vermont prospects would become the center of much of the discussion surrounding the Monadnock, Steamtown in Northern, Steamtown, USA, and even Nelson Blount himself beginning in 1963. Since the hesitation of the Boston Maine Railroad to sell a section of their Cheshire branch had been one of the main reasons Steamtown had failed in Keene, Vermont's willingness to negotiate on a section of railroad seemed very attractive to Blount and his associates. With the high successes of the 1962 passenger season still fresh on their minds, and the nagging depression of the failure of Steamtown, USA to be established in Keene fresh on their heels, Nelson and his associates retreated to their North Walpole engine facility and went back to the drawing board, creating plans to open the Steamtown, USA Museum at Nelson's North Walpole facility. Fresh enthusiasm brewed as they cast their eyes across the Connecticut River towards their future, with unexpected battles lurking just under the surface. Running from Bellows Falls west to Rutland was the Bellows Falls subdivision of the Rutland Railroad, which had only recently shut down in 1961, along with the rest of the Rutland Railroad system, following decades of financial woe and several employee strikes. The Rutland shutdown was a major crisis for Vermonters, who had been following the situation in the press with bated breath, as a major economic engine in their state was threatened. The Rutland Daily Herald wrote on March 16, 1963, "The Rutland Railway situation has been one of idleness for so long that the residents of the area it once served may have to depend on occasional flashes at the movies or on television to remind them of what a railroad train looks like in motion." By that time, freight customers had been awaiting the reactivation of rail freight service for over 2 years. The state of Vermont was searching high and low for operators to take the abandoned Rutland Railroad system and save it from a total loss. The issue had been a major campaign promise for Governor Hoff, and he led the search with fervent dedication. J. Wolfson of the Middletown and New Jersey Railroad was in talks to establish the Vermont Railway to operate most of the former Rutland track in the state, but not the Bellows Falls subdivision, which was still unspoken for. Blount, who was initially hesitant on freight operations, was convinced by Robert Adams, Robert Nimke, and others to consider forming a for-profit corporation to handle freight traffic on the beleaguered Rutland line. This would serve several purposes. Most importantly, it would ensure that the line of interest would stay firmly under the control of a Nelson Blount operation. Excursions would not have to share the tracks with a different railroad like they had in Keene in 1962 and on the Claremont and Concord in 1961. And they would not have to worry about eviction or poor maintenance. There was another clear benefit to this proposal, as Robert W. Adams later recalled.
"We enjoyed working for Nelson, but in this part of the country particularly, it's a limited operation as far as drawing people. We got at most a 4-month operation, and then about 8 months of starvation. In other words, you could perhaps make pretty good money in the summer months, but then there was sort of starvation wages or even a possibility of being laid off in the winter months. I think we talked Nelson Blount into a freight operation to ensure more of a guarantee of year-round employment, and this is what brought the Green Mountain Railroad really into being."
In the Vermont Journal on March 21, 1963, Robert Adams indicated that Blount was so interested in the former Rutland line that he had decided to wait it out rather than accept attractive offers to relocate Steamtown, USA elsewhere in New England or beyond. Unfortunately, despite Blount's enthusiasm, by May 1963, the matter was still mired in considerable controversy. It seemed that a disagreement had sprouted between the Rutland Railroad president William Ginsburg and the state of Vermont surrounding a deadline whence the Rutland could sell the property if no new operators were located. The Rutland argued that the 90-day holding period for the state to assume control or find another operator had started when the ICC granted abandonment to the Rutland's board of directors. And the Rutland argued this period had already expired on April 28th. The state, in return, argued that the 90-day period had not even started, as there were still considerable appeals against the railroad's abandonment that had yet to be heard in court. While this debate over the Rutland line fumed, Blount, keeping his eye on the issue, stepped back to help the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern prepare for its 1963 operating season. Headquarters would be at North Walpole, New Hampshire, at Nelson Blount's engine facility. And the Boston and Maine's Cheshire branch was again to be the stage for trains operating, this time to Westmoreland, New Hampshire, and back, a round trip of about 20 miles. The Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern was granted trackage rights by the Boston and Maine to operate outside of the yard limits at North Walpole from Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., and on Saturday, Sunday, and holidays from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. The Boston and Maine was still running local freights to Keene, performing yard switching at North Walpole, and running their milk train from Bellows Falls to Boston, and those operations would have to move around the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern excursions. Because of this, Boston and Maine movements were expected at any time in the yard at North Walpole. The Boston and Maine still tied down their Bellows Falls switcher at the North Walpole facility, usually on the oil track next to the turntable lead. As it was in 1962, all Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern train and engine service employees were required to take and pass the Boston and Maine's rules examination. At North Walpole, the train would board passengers on the repair track, 2 tracks west of the Cheshire Branch main line through the yard. A parking area was designated west of this location, in the short space between the yard and Route 12. The small ticket booth from Keene was relocated to the yard, and a gift shop and restroom facilities were also prepared. The stretch of the Cheshire Branch adjacent to the Connecticut River was bordered mostly by farmland and was perhaps less dramatic scenery than the previous year's run out of Keene. Additionally, the ongoing New Hampshire Route 12 extension project at Walpole somewhat affected the tranquil, old-fashioned nature of the run. Nevertheless, it was scenic enough, and the hype for the season was positive. Coincidentally, incorporation papers had been filed in Concord, New Hampshire, for the Steamtown Foundation for the Preservation of Steam and Railroad Americana. This was to be a non-profit organization with non-salaried officers to oversee the establishment and operation of the Steamtown, USA Museum. As a non-profit, the organization could now accept the donation of locomotives and rolling stock into its collection. The failure of the state of New Hampshire to acquire Nelson Blount's locomotive collection and fund the building of a museum had resulted in Nelson Blount turning his eyes to form a non-profit organization to oversee his collection. The 6 incorporators and the initial directors of the Steamtown Foundation were Nelson Blount, former New Hampshire Governor Lane Dwinnell of Lebanon, New Hampshire, Blount's attorney Emile Bussière of Manchester, New Hampshire, Mayor Robert L. Mallet Jr. of Keene, attorney and future governor of Vermont Thomas Salmon of Bellows Falls, and E. Spencer Miller of Portland, Maine, president of the Maine Central Railroad. Miller's involvement would help foster the eventual donation of the last 2 Maine Central-owned steam locomotives, number 501 and 519. Other directors included William Murphy, president of the Campbell Soup Company and the chairman of Radio Free Europe, and Frederick H. Richardson, Nelson's best friend and executive vice president of Blount Seafood Corporation. The foundation was to immediately begin to acquire the Blount collection of over 60 locomotives, cars, and railroad equipment, noting that a final location in Vermont was wholly dependent on the ongoing discussions involving the state of Vermont and the Rutland Railroad. As such, 1963 was the first season where Steamtown, USA officially opened as a museum. By this time, much of Nelson Blount's collection had been moved up from the Pleasure Island Amusement Park in Wakefield, Massachusetts, packing the small Fitchburg Yard and engine facilities at North Walpole. The collection at North Walpole in 1963 included 25 steam locomotives, 8 cabooses, a steam shovel, steam roller, steam crane, wooden railroad snowplow, and various passenger cars and pieces of rolling stock. There had been some brochures for the 1962 season, along with hints towards the Steamtown project, but the advertisement for 1963 was extensive. Intricate brochures jointly heralded the Monadnock, Steamtown and Northern, Steamtown, USA, and the Edaville Railroad. They also carried a new nickname for the Monadnock, Steamtown and Northern, the Staghead Line, named after Blount's mountainside farm in Dublin, New Hampshire. The diner lounge car, Mountaineer, still accompanied every run, with service this time offered by Monadnock, Steamtown and Northern employees, led by college student Chip Howard. Ralph Hogenkamp, whose chicken barbecue had fed passengers in Bradford, again offered food service in the yard at North Walpole, and the small gift shop was manned by Richie Ashcroft. 2 signs on the shop made clear the organization's intentions, especially in the face of so much previous opposition.
This is a non-profit educational museum. It is operated by the Steamtown Foundation, whose trustees are dedicated to the preservation of Americana for the period of steam, 1850 to 1950. Donations of Americana or financial support to this foundation will be greatly appreciated. The trustees of the Steamtown Foundation are planning to erect buildings to permanently house an expanded collection of steam Americana, which last operated in the New England area. Your admission ticket is your vote to the trustees that there is sufficient interest to warrant their continuing efforts toward this end.
For the 1963 season, trains ran weekends only from May 19th to June 23rd, daily from June 29th to September 2nd, and again weekends only from September 7th through October 27th. Trips were also made on Memorial Day, Labor Day, and Columbus Day. Interestingly, autumn foliage runs, longer runs into the Connecticut River Valley, began on weekends after September 2nd. These trains ran to Gilboa, the previous stopping point for trains running out of Keene in 1962. From July 25th to July 27th, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern once again returned to its old home of Keene for Steamtown Days. This promotional opportunity for Keene merchants was advertised with special deals in exchange for tickets. Trains departed Keene and operated as far as North Walpole. Once the weekend was over, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern never again returned to Keene, and this would be the last time a steam locomotive would ever operate in the city of Keene. Tony Reddington, now public relations officer, reported on July 25th that 10,000 had already ridden the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern since the start of the season. By August, the numbers continued to climb. The weekend of August 10th and 11th broke records. Sunday, August 11th, saw a total of 660 riders, with 380 on the 2:00 p.m. trip alone. 425 total on Saturday, August 10th, made for a stunning weekend tally of 1,085 riders. These numbers were already as much as 75% ahead of the numbers for the 1962 season. Weekday trips were faring well too, with runs averaging 300 riders a day, double the Keene figures from 1962. Frederick G. Bailey, who would go on to serve as the Steamtown Foundation's Director of Operations and the Assistant General Manager from 1980 to 1987, was 15 years old in 1963. From his parents' home in Walpole, Bailey would sit on the porch and wave to number 15 in the train of yellow coaches passing by just across the road.
After a few weeks, I started hopping on my bicycle and riding about half, 3/4 of a mile to Cold River. There you could watch the train coming in. It's a straightaway of about 3 miles where you can see the train come into view. I'd go by you and curve away towards North Walpole, which was the terminus at the time. You'd hear the whistle blow for the Route 12 grade crossing, and then the train would work with the heavy exhaust the last mile or two into the terminal at North Walpole. That was one of my favorite things to do. After being there a few times, particularly on the afternoon trip, an automobile, a Cadillac with license plates Rhode Island NB2, would pull up, and a gentleman in the car would watch the train come back in, basically in the same fashion as I described. I didn't know it at the time, but Nelson Blount would come into work most days, run the first 2 excursions of the day, do whatever business he had to perform, and then on his way home, he'd stop there at Cold River and watch the train come home for the last time each day. On one particular day, I'll never forget it, I was riding my bicycle down to the location where I usually watch the train from. The Cadillac was parked beside the road, and the gentleman inside yelled, "Hey son, come over here for a minute." Well, I didn't know quite what to expect at that point. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong or was going to get the devil for something. But the gentleman said, "You like steam engines, don't you?" I said, "Yes sir, I do." He said, "Well, let me tell you, I like steam engines too. I'm Nelson Blount." At that point, I got to meet the man who was really one of my childhood heroes. I don't know why, but many times thereafter in that summer of '63, we would have a chance meeting as the last train of the day came back to North Walpole to roost. Why he told me of the things that he did during that summer, I certainly wasn't a businessman. I guess maybe it was just that I was interested in trains and what he was doing. Now that I think about it, I think sometimes after a busy day with the many problems that Mr. Blount had to deal with, he was just looking for someone to have a nice chat with. That summer did offer me my first railroad job. He said I was a little too young at the time to actually work on his trains, but he had a whole yard full of locomotives in North Walpole, that the weeds were growing up around. He offered me the opportunity to go up and pull those weeds, and in return, gave me a pass that allowed me to ride his excursion anytime I desired. You can bet I was on my bicycle real quick to get up to North Walpole and pull those weeds. Frederick G. Bailey.
The Brattleboro reformer heralded Steamtown and the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern as booming and a top summer attraction. By the start of September, 21,000 visitors had ridden the excursions to Westmoreland and back. Behind all that success, though, was concern that the topography at North Walpole made it impossible for adequate parking and expansion. This was surely among the issues weighing on Nelson's minds during his afternoon chats with Fred Bailey. Blount knew that room at North Walpole was limited and that both the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern and Steamtown, USA would need to move in order to grow into the roles that he and the Foundation envisioned. Negotiations for a permanent home in Vermont along the Rutland tracks were taking longer than expected and made the future uncertain. Soon, however, discussions between Blount and the Vermont Public Service Board concerning the former Rutland line yielded encouraging results. A 5-year trial period was proposed to run the line for freight and excursion services. Blount, confident on the entire line's potential, offered to run freight all the way into Rutland for the first 2 years, and said he would pick up any deficit involved personally. If, after the preliminary 2-year period, the line proved unprofitable, then operations would only go as far as Chester or Ludlow. A deadline of November 4th was established between the Rutland Railroad and the state to decide on an operator, after which the Rutland had the right to scrap their tracks and wash their hands of the matter. Blount, speaking of the state's involvement, said he was amazed and elated at Vermont's willingness and success in initially purchasing the line to save it from the scrappers. Around the same time, the Boston Maine Railroad was interested in picking up any business shed by the Rutland Railroad, especially in the immediate area of Bellows Falls, and they had also made an offer for the line to Rutland, but had entered late into the discussions. The Boston Maine was also willing to operate a local freight from Bellows Falls to the decided western terminus, but not less than 2 days per week. The Boston Maine in the early 1960s was showing distressing signs of sickness, coming off the heels of the controversial Patrick B. McGinnis administration and heading into the Daniel A. Benson administration. Both men were later jailed in 1966 for financial fraud involving the sale of railroad assets. The Boston Maine was selling off property and retiring facilities, seeking abandonment on several lines, and witnessing a freight and passenger decline. Despite the offer from the corporate railroad giant, Vermont opted to move forward with negotiations with Nelson Blount and the Green Mountain Railroad. With the Boston Maine destined for a disastrous 1970 bankruptcy, Vermont likely made a wise decision in moving forward with Nelson Blount in the Green Mountain Railroad. The first green light for the Green Mountain Railroad came on November 4th, 1963. The Vermont Public Service Board made a formal announcement that it would purchase for $400,000 the Bellows Falls to Ludlow section of the Rutland line and lease it to Blount on a 5-year lease with renewal options. This 28-mile section would include the lucrative talc plants in Chester and Ludlow. The rest of the line to Rutland was initially expected to be scrapped, yet Blount voiced interest in the remaining 26 miles despite there being virtually no online customers. The name chosen for the planned freight operation was the Green Mountain Railroad Corporation, to be helmed mainly by its new vice president, Robert W. Adams. And so, Nelson Blount found himself the president of a freight railroad as well. But importantly for him, the deal with the state of Vermont also included a clause to acquire and lease 18 acres of land in Rockingham, just up the Connecticut River from Bellows Falls. This land had most recently been owned by the Rutland Railroad, and the plot was earmarked as a potential new home for Steamtown, USA. Nelson's constant searching for the right home had resulted in visits to a number of potential sites in Vermont in 1963 and 1964. Nelson Blount and his famous collection were quickly becoming nationally known throughout 1963 in newspaper and magazine articles. On October 21st, he had appeared as a mystery guest on the popular national game show To Tell the Truth, in which a panel of celebrities attempted to tell him apart from two other imposters, pretending to be the real Nelson Blount.
One of these men collects steam locomotives. So far, he has 62 of them. What is your name, please?
My name is Nelson Blount.
My name is Nelson Blount.
My name is Nelson Blount.
Only one of these men is the real Nelson Blount. The other two are imposters and will try to fool this panel. Orson Bean, Peggy Cass, Gene Rayburn, and Kitty Carlisle. On To Tell the Truth. And here is our host.
My goal is to establish a museum of steam railroading where all the equipment can have a permanent home. I plan to call it Steamtown, USA. Signed, Nelson Blount.
Number 3, where do you store your trains now?
Bellows Falls, Vermont.
Thank you.
Number 3. I'll move over, all right. What was the last time you had up a full head of steam on one of your locomotives?
Last Sunday.
And did you drive it anywhere?
Oh, yes, we run 20 miles.
And what type locomotive was it?
Well, that was a steam locomotive, wheel arrangement called 280.
I voted for number 3. I figured that a guy with all that rolling stock would want to roll it someplace. Number 2 said there wasn't much track, and I don't know why I didn't like number 1.
I voted for number 3, too, because he knew about Casey Jones's engine, and also when he said Bellows Falls, Vermont, it sounded to me that that's where I'd keep my railroad if I had one.
Well, I voted for number 3 because I know about Bellows Falls. It's just a small town, it's just a little town, but it's near White River Junction.
What does that mean?
I thought number 3 looked like the sort of a man who would collect railroads. He's got that kind of engineer's steely look with a slitty eyes.
Slitty eyes. All right, there we are. We got all the votes in. We go now for the truth to find out how well our panelists, all 5 of them, did, as we learn now which one of these gentlemen actually is the one who is the creator of Steamtown, USA. So will the real Nelson Blount please stand up? In any event, I'd like you to know that all of Nelson Blount's collection will eventually be given to the Steamtown Foundation for the Preservation of Railroad Antiquities, temporarily located in Bellows Falls, Vermont. Number 1, what is your real name?
Additional publicity for Blount and his operations came earlier that year when number 15, 2 coaches, a combine, and a caboose had traveled over the Boston and Maine to the Boston area to be featured in the film The Cardinal, a historical fiction starring Tom Tryon, John Huston, and Burgess Meredith. Gamma Productions paid $4,000 for the use of the equipment, contracted between February 15th and March 2nd. The Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern logos were temporarily removed, and the right side of the locomotive was relettered Boston and Maine. Servicing and turning of the locomotive was done at the Boston and Albany's Beacon Park Engine House. Blount, who was present on the film set, supplied an engineer, conductor, brakeman, and station master in period clothing to work the train and appear in the film, which was set in Boston around the time of the First World War. On a bitterly cold February 16th, shooting commenced of number 15 steaming into Trinity Place Station in Back Bay, and later coming to a stop at Pine Grove on the Boston and Albany's Newton Lower Falls branch. Following its brief stardom, the equipment returned to North Walpole via the Cheshire branch, on the rear of a Boston and Maine milk train. The film went on to win the Golden Globe for Best Motion Picture Drama, was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, and was mentioned in future brochures whenever number 15 was the mode of power. As word of Steamtown USA's potential spread around the country, offers poured in from cities and organizations in every imaginable place. Holiday Inn magnate David Williams and the Central Florida Steamtown Foundation tried repeatedly to appeal to Blount. Local newspapers in New Hampshire and Vermont picked up the attempts from outside parties with considerable concern. The 1963 season had been successful, and they did not want to lose the Golden Goose, which was now finally showing signs of success. Despite the offers, pamphlets, phone calls, and sponsored trips, Nelson was a New Englander at heart. He truly enjoyed the Connecticut River Valley and the Monadnock region that had become home to him, his family, and his collection. On multiple occasions, both in press interviews and speeches, Blount spoke of his desire to keep Steamtown local. The economics of moving the collection elsewhere after having already moved it to the area could not be written off, nor could the increasingly encouraging negotiations with Vermont on the former Rutland line. The year that was 1963 had been a year of victories for Nelson Blount, the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern, and Steamtown, USA. The successful operating season had blasted records and put the attraction on the map, bolstered by coverage in newspapers, on TV, and even a Hollywood film. Negotiations with the state government were finally proving successful. A solid foundation had been laid for the freight-hauling Green Mountain Railroad, for which the Articles of Association were filed at Bellows Falls on November 13th. Nelson's collection was protected by a new non-profit Steamtown Foundation, and communities both local and distant were begging to be the home of the new Steamtown, USA. Yet the successes would soon be overshadowed by new challenges, just as storm clouds appeared over the nation with 3 sniper shots in the streets of Dallas, Texas. The close of 1963 was to be a time of great uncertainty for the nation, and in Bellows Falls, storm clouds of a different sort began to brew over the Blount operations. Although 1964 was destined to be a year with its own victories, new challenges would attempt to derail the proposed Green Mountain Railroad and the future of the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern and Steamtown, USA. Boston and Maine employees in Bellows Falls, backed by their union representatives, had begun an attempt to block the proposed Green Mountain Railroad takeover of the former Rutland customers and the defunct Rutland line. Giro R. Padalano, a Boston and Maine brakeman, had brushed elbows with Blount in town, and it was no secret that the two did not see eye to eye. Padalano argued that the Boston and Maine was better suited to provide freight service over the entirety of the former Rutland line, rather than Blount's trial basis between Bellows Falls and Ludlow. This, however, was in direct conflict to the Boston and Maine's written interest of only being as far as Ludlow. Padalano and the Boston and Maine employees believed that Blount's operations would levy adverse effects upon the communities of Bellows Falls, Springfield, Rutland, and the area between Ludlow and Rutland. Furthermore, they claimed that more than a dozen railroad jobs would be lost in the Bellows Falls area, even though the Green Mountain would be serving former customers of the Rutland and not the Boston and Maine's current customers. Apparently, the Springfield Terminal Railway, a Boston and Maine-owned short line operation several miles north up the Connecticut River, had been handling freight for the stranded Rutland customers. Presumably, this was done by transloading freight from rail cars into trucks at Springfield so that they could be trucked to the Rutland customers on the Rutland line in limbo. Padalano voiced fears that if the Green Mountain Railroad started operating on the Rutland line, this would divert that business away from the Springfield terminal and Boston and Maine employees. Additionally, there were fears of the non-union Green Mountain Railroad operating in the Bellows Falls area, and the Boston and Maine had hoped to pick up the former Rutland customers for itself. Interestingly enough, Padalano and his B&M peers initially did not seem to take up any issues with the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern excursion trains, claiming that if the Boston and Maine were awarded the former Rutland line, they could lease trackage rights to the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern excursion trains. Padalano later stated that he had advanced the proposal that neither the Boston and Maine nor Steamtown be given exclusive rights over the trackage. Blount's people responded, claiming that the Boston and Maine had shown little interest in the trackage in question until it was announced that freight customers would be served by a new freight corporation founded by Blount. On December 5, 1963, Boston and Maine officials, including President Daniel Benson, held a meeting in Montpelier with Governor Hoff. Although details on the meeting were not released, an aide to the governor did disclose that the state and Blount had already signed a letter of intent concerning their agreement on the line. The state admitted that they felt they had an obligation to Blount based on their earlier negotiations, but were willing to consider any objections filed by the Boston and Maine. Governor Hoff stated that he was hopeful that Blount and the Boston and Maine would be able to come to terms and settle their differences before another hearing would have to be proposed. 1964, they hoped, would bring a solution at last. 1964 arrived in much the same way that 1963 had, with political debate. With the United States now mired in great uncertainty, so too were the futures of Steamtown, USA, and the yet-to-be-incorporated Green Mountain Railroad. Discussions between the Boston and Maine, the state of Vermont, and Blount's camp had resulted in the scheduling of a new Public Service Board hearing on Thursday, January 23rd. The purpose would be to determine whether the incorporation of the Green Mountain Railroad and the granting of operating rights on the state-owned former Rutland line would benefit the state of Vermont. The gallery was packed with employees and friends of the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, Steamtown USA, and the Boston and Maine, the latter of which opposed the proposition that Blount set out to achieve. Starting at 10:30 a.m. and running for a solid 7 hours with recess, the board heard 24 witnesses testify with enthusiasm on behalf of the proposed Green Mountain Railroad. Much focus for the enthusiasm was the starting of a locally based short-line railroad, as opposed to the Boston and Maine, headquartered in Boston. The following day, the hearing convened with 14 witnesses testifying, 4 of which testified against the establishment of the Green Mountain and the granting of freight rights. All 4 were representatives of the Boston and Maine and its labor unions. Brakeman Giro Padolano once again voiced fears that 20 employees of the Boston and Maine would be displaced, $110,000 of payroll would be lost, and Boston and Maine freight interests could be threatened. When pressed, the Boston and Maine revealed that many of the employees would still have jobs, albeit possibly with relocation to other areas. Surprisingly, and in contrast to the earlier objections levied by the Boston and Maine, most of the Boston and Maine and union representatives did not have any issues with the lease of the Rutland line as a whole to Blount. Rather, their objections lay almost solely with freight switching in the immediate Bellows Falls area. The hearing closed with no decision, but assurance by the state was made that one would be made in due time once records had been submitted and approved. Throughout February and into early March, the word was still out, but state officials revealed that they were nearly ready to announce their final decision. It would not be until the end of the month, on March 26, 1964, that the state of Vermont would finally give the green light for the incorporation and formation of the Green Mountain Railroad Corporation. Blount was convinced by his employees to enter a purchase agreement for the Rutland Railroad's former Alco RS-1 diesel locomotive number 405. This locomotive, which had worked for the Rutland Railroad since 1951, would become the Green Mountain's first locomotive. The Green Mountain Railroad Corporation was officially chartered by the state of Vermont on April 3, 1964. By April 17th, the state and Blount had verbally agreed on a pending 5-year lease from Bellows Falls to Ludlow. Likely bitter because of the announcement, the Boston and Maine was silent about agreeing with the Green Mountain Railroad to operate in the Bellows Falls yard, or working with them to interchange freight to and from the Rutland line. Despite the delay in the start of freight operations, the green light was given for passenger excursions, which could begin whenever the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern was ready for their 1964 season. Local reaction to the news was positive in Bellows Falls, Chester, and Ludlow, not only due to developments on the renewal of freight service, but the affirmation that it was all the likelier that Steamtown, USA would be permanently established in the area. The start of the freight-hauling Green Mountain Railroad had preoccupied local attention at the end of 1963 and the start of 1964, but the Steamtown, USA Museum was still very much on the public's mind. The kinks were finally being worked out with the Boston and Maine, and Blount scheduled a meeting for May 28th at the railroad's headquarters on Causeway Street in Boston. There, Nelson was to meet with B&M executives to discuss the issues over the Bellows Falls freight yard. The events of these next few days moved very quickly. As Nelson prepared for the important meeting in Boston, the rest of the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern crews were preparing the 1964 excursion season. Excursions were to run over the former Rutland line from Bellows Falls to Chester and return, with trains boarding at the Riverside location, which had been earmarked as the likely spot for Steamtown in Vermont. To reach Riverside, the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern would have to use the Boston and Maine's Cheshire branch to cross the river from North Walpole into Bellows Falls, then would need to cross over the Boston and Maine's Connecticut River main line to enter the Green Mountain Railroad territory. In this way, the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern found themselves stuck. Although Blount controlled the yard tracks at North Walpole where his equipment was stored, and he controlled the Green Mountain Railroad in Bellows Falls, the Boston and Maine would not allow the Green Mountain Railroad to use their tracks between North Walpole and the Green Mountain Railroad tracks. Therefore, even though he had been given the green light by the state of Vermont to run on greener pastures west of the Connecticut River, Blount was powerless to begin the season. The Rutland Railroad, in its final death throes, came to Blount with a rescue proposition. Vermont had not yet taken over the assets of the Rutland Railroad, meaning that all previous agreements that the Rutland had with the Boston and Maine still stood. The Rutland Railroad had an agreement with the Boston and Maine to use their turntable at North Walpole for their larger locomotives. This meant that the Rutland Railroad had trackage rights over the Boston and Maine trackage. The Rutland, not yet officially defunct, still maintained those trackage rights across the Boston and Maine's Connecticut River main line crossing at Bellows Falls, and then over the river into the yard at North Walpole, where Blount's equipment was trapped. The once great Rutland Railroad would go out in one final act, and on May 28, 1964, at 4:00 a.m., they did so. As commanded by the Rutland Railroad's remaining board of directors, Alco RS1 number 405, the Rutland's final remaining locomotive and not yet officially owned by the Green Mountain Railroad, crept over the Diamond Crossing with the Boston and Maine's Connecticut River main line, and began to remove the needed equipment from North Walpole. Monadnock Northern number 15, 2 cabooses and 10 coaches were secretly hauled to a siding on the Green Mountain Railroad side. Coincidentally, Nelson Blount was in his meeting with the Boston and Maine at 150 Causeway Street later that morning, when news of the spectacle arrived. In the face of irate Boston and Maine officials, Nelson calmly reminded the Boston and Maine of the old agreement, which justified the Rutland Railroad's unconventional but legitimate actions. Despite the controversial incident, the importance of the Green Mountain Railroad to begin freight operations to help the customers resulted in the start of a generally workable situation, which would satisfy the labor unions as well as the Boston and Maine. The Boston and Maine would still not allow access to Nelson's yard and facility at North Walpole, and this made servicing excursion equipment a hassle throughout the 1964 season. And that season began the very next day, May 29, 1964. Rockingham town manager Cecil Bissonnette had rallied the town for assistance in setting up a temporary depot and Spartan facilities for the expected crowds. The Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern kicked off its 1964 operating season with students from the Putney, Vermont public schools, making the first trip, which departed at 11:25 a.m. Many of these children had never even ridden a train before in this era of expanding interstate highways. At Chester, a grand reception of old was complete, with the Chester High School Band and twirlers. Townspeople came out in earnest to welcome the train, and rail fans swarmed every which way, cameras close to the chest, documenting every angle. The jubilant mood was not even dampened when Diesel number 405 hauled the train back to Riverside. In total, the first day saw 755 paid attendees, with an additional 110 children riding free of charge. An additional burst of publicity came on June 10th, when the Reverend Billy Graham rode the train along with his son W. Franklin, staff member Douglas Judson, and song leader Cliff Barrows. Graham, en route to Prince Edward Island, had stopped on the invitation of Blount, a deeply religious man himself. Afterward, the party returned to Blount's Staghead Farm in Dublin for a game of softball. Prospects continued to mount for Steamtown. Through his Wall Street connections, Edgar Meade had introduced Nelson to many major railroad executives, including those at the Union Pacific. An announcement was made on June 16th that the Union Pacific had donated one of their 1,250,000 pound 4884 Big Boy locomotives, number 4012, to the Steamtown Foundation. These were some of the largest locomotives ever built and had been retired in 1960. The giant locomotive traveled up the Cheshire Branch on September 23, 1964, towed at 15 miles per hour by the Boston and Maine's Bellows Falls Local. With New England's famous fall foliage once again setting in along the Connecticut River and up the Williams River Valley to Chester, passengers flocked to Riverside to ride the Monadnock Northern. 60,000 visitors had attended the two attractions so far in 1964, with approximately 37,000 riding the trains and 23,000 visiting Steamtown, USA at North Walpole. This was a great increase from 1963, which had seen around 40,000 paid attendees by the end of the season. 1964 was also the first season where two steam locomotives were used side by side and even together. Canadian Pacific G5 462 number 1293 had been recently purchased by Blount the previous winter. This was a relatively modern steam locomotive built in 1948 for the Canadian Pacific. The locomotive was fired up in September and would operate only until the end of the season, as it required an ICC inspection and the line was not yet under ICC jurisdiction in 1964. Special fall foliage excursions to Ludlow kicked off with a steam doubleheader on Sunday, September 13th, with number 15 leading the way along with number 1293. On the matter of the Green Mountain Railroad, freight rights were assured between Bellows Falls and Ludlow, but the 18 miles beyond, between Ludlow and Rutland, had still not been acquired by the state of Vermont. Rutland Railroad President Ginsburg announced his intention on September 2nd to sell the final section for scrap if the state did not purchase it by September 4th. Governor Hoff attempted to pump the brakes and requested that Ginsburg delay his decision. Blount voiced concerns that the Green Mountain Railroad was interested in the entire line because there was still no agreement from the Boston and Maine to interchange freight cars in Bellows Falls. Until the Boston and Maine cooperated, and without the outside world connection at Rutland, freight service on the line would be pointless. The startup of the Green Mountain had been tenuous, and the delays from the Boston and Maine, the Rutland Railroad, and the state of Vermont were taking their toll not only on freight customers, but Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern employees as well. It is important to remember that a major reason for the creation of the Green Mountain Railroad was not only to provide freight service, but to employ Monadnock Northern personnel in the excursion off-season. Blount had been operating the 1964 excursions on a verbal agreement, and no official lease had been submitted to or approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission because of delays from the Boston and Maine. These delays to the start of Green Mountain Railroad operations had forced Blount to reduce Monadnock Steamtown employees from 42 to 8, a count on the decrease in business from the end of the regular operating season and the uncertainty as to the start of the regular Green Mountain Railroad freight operations. As another year ended, it seemed that delays in bureaucratic matters had become a vicious cycle for the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern and the Green Mountain Railroad, and especially for the creation of Steamtown, USA. For nearly 4 years now, the museum had been in limbo looking for a permanent home. And although the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern was operating safely now in Vermont, the Green Mountain Railroad's lease on the state trackage was not yet approved. Of course, these were complicated dealings with many moving parts, including state and local government approval and support from cooperating railroads. Thankfully, 1965 would be the year where plans would finally begin to fall in place, and, for a short time, Nelson Blount's dream began to become reality.